The entire history of ancient Egypt stretches across more than 3,000 years, from the unification of the two lands around 3100 BCE to the fall of Cleopatra VII and the Roman conquest in 30 BCE. It is a story that begins in the fertile valley of the Nile, a river that gave life to one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known. Along its banks, farmers became builders, rulers became gods, and time itself seemed to move with the rhythm of its floods. Here, kings were more than men. They were divine figures who stood between heaven and earth. Their rule brought stability to the desert, order to chaos, and purpose to an existence shaped by faith. Theirs was a world guided by Ma'at, the eternal balance between justice, harmony, and truth. It was a belief that the universe itself could fall apart if Ma'at were broken. This was Egypt, a land that measured eternity in stone. From the Step Pyramid at Saqqara to the Great Pyramid of Giza, from Thebes to Alexandria, every monument whispered a single truth, that death was not an end, but a continuation. The Nile carried this truth through centuries of triumph and collapse, through the reigns of pharaohs and the invasions of foreigners, through worship and war. Egypt's history unfolds across great ages, each rising and falling like the river itself. The early dynastic period, circa 3100 to 2686 BC, saw the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under King Narmer, the founder of the first dynasty. The Old Kingdom, circa 2686 to 2181 BCE, was an age of order and monumental ambition, when kings built pyramids that touched the heavens. After the collapse came the first intermediate period, circa 2181 to 2055 BCE, a time of famine and fragmentation. Yet from this darkness rose renewal. The Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 to 1650 BCE, a golden age of art, literature, and faith. Foreign rulers known as the Hyksos seized power during the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE. But Egypt struck back and reclaimed its destiny in the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, the empire of Ramses, Hatshepsut, and Akhenaten. The centuries that followed, the late dynastic period, c. 1070 to 332 BCE, brought decline and division until Alexander the Great arrived in 332 BCE, followed by the Ptolemies, and finally Rome. Through it all, Egypt remained. Its language evolved, its gods changed names, but its soul, shaped by the Nile and guided by Ma'at, never faded. Even when hieroglyphs were forgotten and temples turned to dust, the spirit of Egypt endured, immortal as the desert that guards its tombs. This is the story of that endurance, of power, faith, and memory carved in stone. This is the entire history of ancient Egypt, from the dawn of kings to the death of Cleopatra. In the fading millennia before recorded time, the Nile River was the spine of a land that would soon shape world history. For thousands of years before Egypt became a unified kingdom, scattered farming communities lived along its banks. Each year, the river's floodwaters rose and fell with regular rhythm, depositing rich black silt that allowed wheat and barley to flourish. By around 5000 BCE, small settlements dotted the river's edge. These people learned to channel the floods through irrigation, built mud brick homes, and buried their dead with care, hinting at early beliefs about life beyond death. Over time, two distinct cultural regions emerged: the fertile delta in the north, known as Lower Egypt, and the narrow valley to the south, called Upper Egypt. By the late 4th millennium BCE, rival chiefdoms dominated these regions. Archaeologists have identified powerful centers such as Hierakonpolis, Naqada, and Abydos in Upper Egypt, and Buto and Mahdi in the Delta. Each had its own local gods, trade routes, and symbols of authority. Competition between these early polities intensified as they sought control of resources and access to luxury goods from Nubia, the Levant, and the Red Sea. Pottery, art, and early hieroglyphic signs from this pre-dynastic period show growing complexity, a culture moving steadily toward statehood. Around 3100 BCE, this era of fragmented power ended with the rise of a ruler known as Narmer, remembered by later generations as the unifier of Egypt. The evidence of his achievement survives on the Narmer palette, a ceremonial slab of green siltstone discovered at Hierakonpolis. On one side, Narmer wears the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down a kneeling enemy. On the other, he dons the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing his dominion over both lands. Between these images lies the earliest known visual statement of kingship: one ruler, one nation, one divine order. Though scholars still debate whether Narmer and the legendary Menes were the same person, the act of unification is undisputed. The unification of Egypt was more than a conquest. It was the creation of the first territorial state in history, stretching nearly 1,000 kilometers along the Nile. To hold such a land together required not only armies, but also administration, ideology, and communication. The early kings of the first dynasty, Narmer, Aha, Jur, Jet, Din, Anajib, Semerket, and Qa, built this structure from the ground up. Their royal tombs at Abydos, with subsidiary burials for courtiers and retainers, reflect both their power and the belief that the king's divine essence extended beyond death. Memphis, founded near the apex of the Delta, became the political heart of this new Egypt. Strategically placed between Upper and Lower Egypt, it served as both capital and symbol of unity. From here, the early pharaohs directed trade, taxation, and temple construction. The king was more than ruler. He was seen as the living Horus, the falcon god, maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance of truth, justice, and harmony. Each king's duty was to uphold this order against chaos, both within the land and beyond its borders. During the first dynasty, writing matured from simple symbols into true hieroglyphs. These pictorial signs, used first for labeling goods and recording ownership, evolved into a full script capable of expressing language. On ivory tags and clay seals from tombs at Abydos, we find the earliest royal names inscribed within serec frames, a precursor to the cartouche. Writing became not only a tool of administration, but a sacred act that bound the king's name to eternity. The economy of early Egypt depended on agriculture, but it was managed through a growing bureaucracy. Granaries collected surplus grain, while scribes recorded deliveries and redistributed food to workers, soldiers, and temple staff. Craftsmen in copper, gold, and stone flourished under royal patronage, producing fine vessels, palettes, and jewelry for the elite. Trade caravans moved south into Nubia to obtain gold, ivory, and ebony, and northward toward Canaan and the Sinai to gather copper and precious stones. Egypt's wealth, though still fragile, was already drawing the attention of its neighbors. Religious ideas also began to crystallize. Each local god, Horus at Nekhen, Seth at Nakata, Neith at Sais, and Ta at Memphis, retained importance, but the king's divine role unified them into a single spiritual order. The concept of the afterlife grew more elaborate, as seen in grave goods buried with the dead. These early tombs, made of wood and mud brick, foreshadowed the monumental structures to come. The royal necropolis at Abydos, in particular, became a sacred landscape where the first pharaohs were buried amid rituals linking them to Osiris, the god of resurrection. The Second Dynasty, circa 2890 to 2686 BCE, followed, bringing consolidation and early challenges to unity. Kings such as Hotep Sekemwe, Ranab Ninedger, and Kheskemwe ruled from Memphis and continued to expand the reach of royal authority. Their names often referenced reconciliation and divine power. Hotep Sekemwe's name means the two powers are at peace, perhaps signifying the stabilization of Upper and Lower Egypt after conflict. Archaeological finds suggest periods of civil unrest, possibly due to rival claims or local resistance. Kheskemwe, the final ruler of the Second Dynasty, stands as a bridge between turmoil and renewal. His name, meaning the two powers appear, suggests that he successfully restored unity after internal strife. In his reign, we find early examples of large-scale stone construction and artistic refinement that would define the Old Kingdom. His statues from Hierakonpolis, among the earliest known royal sculptures, show a king of commanding presence, both human and divine. By the close of the Second Dynasty, the foundations of Egyptian civilization were firmly established. The concept of divine kingship was absolute. The state's administrative machinery extended from the palace at Memphis to distant provincial towns. The royal titulary, a formal list of names emphasizing divine and earthly roles, became a central expression of pharaonic identity. Religion, writing, and architecture were now instruments of statecraft, shaping a society where every element served to uphold Ma'at. The landscape of Egypt itself played an integral role in sustaining this order. The Nile's predictable rhythm allowed for planning and record-keeping, disciplines that became essential to governance. The desert plateaus bordering the valley provided not only protection from invasion, but also stone for building and tomb construction. This combination of natural stability and geographic isolation allowed Egypt to evolve in relative security, developing a distinct identity unmatched in the ancient world. Even in this early age, Egypt's worldview was expansive. Expeditions to the Sinai for copper and turquoise were launched under royal oversight. Seal impressions from the First Dynasty have been found as far away as southern Palestine, revealing contact with neighboring cultures. These exchanges brought not only materials but ideas, foreign influences that Egypt absorbed and reshaped into its own tradition. As the early dynastic period drew to a close, architectural innovation began to shift toward permanence. Tombs at Saqqara evolved from simple mastabas, rectangular brick structures, to more complex designs incorporating stone elements. The transition from mud brick to limestone would soon revolutionize Egyptian architecture. It was a transformation driven not by aesthetics alone, but by belief. If the king's life and rule were eternal, his resting place must endure for eternity as well. Society beneath the pharaoh was stratified but functional. Officials known as Ayamwire oversaw departments such as agriculture, granaries, and temple estates. The priesthood, though still subordinate to the throne, managed daily rituals to honor the gods. Artisans and laborers provided the physical labor that sustained monumental building, while peasants remained the backbone of the economy, working the fields in rhythm with the river's rise and fall. Despite hierarchy, the system worked in harmony, a reflection of Ma'at in earthly form. Culturally, the Egyptians developed a visual language that would remain remarkably consistent for 3,000 years. The canonical artistic style, figures in composite view, with head and legs in profile but torso facing forward, emerged during this period. It was not mere convention but a symbolic representation of completeness, showing every part of the body necessary for recognition in the afterlife. The same logic guided the earliest hieroglyphic inscriptions, which blended art and writing into a seamless whole. In myth, the king was both Horus, the divine falcon, and the son of Ra, the sun god. Upon death, he became Osiris, ruler of the underworld, ensuring the continuity of cosmic order. These intertwined identities justified royal power and linked the cycle of kingship to the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, mirrored in the Nile's floods. Every coronation, festival, and building project reinforced this sacred narrative. By c. 2686 BCE, Egypt stood ready to enter a new age. Centuries of unification, experimentation, and religious synthesis had prepared the way for a leap in scale and ambition. The architects of the Third Dynasty would soon replace brick with stone, turning the dream of eternity into physical form. What began as a scattered collection of river villages had become a centralized state under divine rule, literate, organized, and confident in its destiny. The dawn of the two lands was complete. From the victory of Narmer to the reign of Khesgemwi, Egypt had risen from prehistory to civilization, creating a model of kingship and stability that the world would remember for millennia. The lessons learned in these early centuries, control of resources, divine legitimacy, and monumental expression, would shape every era that followed. And on the western cliffs above Abydos, where the desert meets the floodplain, the tombs of the first kings still lie beneath the sands, silent witnesses to the birth of history itself. The unification of Egypt had given birth to a new world, a land ruled not by tribal chiefs, but by divine kings who claimed descent from the gods. As the Third Dynasty began around 2686 BCE, the kings of Egypt sought to embody eternity itself in stone. Their ambition would define the Old Kingdom, an age of stability, grandeur, and architectural genius that lasted for more than 5 centuries. The first great innovator of this new era was King Djoser. His reign marked a decisive turning point in Egypt's history, the moment when the pharaoh's divine power was no longer expressed through wood and mud brick, but through monumental stone. At Saqqara, Djoser's chief architect, Imhotep, designed a tomb unlike any seen before, the Step Pyramid. Rising in 6 tiers, it was the first structure in the world built entirely of dressed stone. Imhotep conceived it as a vast, eternal stairway to the heavens, a physical expression of the king's ascent to join the gods. Beneath the pyramid lay an intricate network of chambers and tunnels lined with blue faience tiles, symbolizing the waters of the afterlife. The Step Pyramid complex was not merely a tomb, it was an entire architectural universe. Surrounding the pyramid were courtyards, shrines, and temples dedicated to the king's Ka, or spiritual essence. Stone walls carved with imitation wooden doors and reed mats mimicked the palaces of the living world. Djoser's complex demonstrated a revolution in both engineering and religious ideology. The king's body might perish, but his spirit would endure eternally within the stone sanctuaries built for him. Djoser's successors, such as Sekhemkhet and Kaaba, continued to experiment with pyramid design, though their monuments remained unfinished. Yet these efforts marked the beginning of an unbroken architectural evolution that would reach its zenith a century later at Giza. The innovations of the Third Dynasty prepared the ground for the immense achievements of the Fourth. When Sneferu ascended the throne around 2613 BCE, Egypt entered a period of remarkable prosperity and centralized control. Sneferu was both conqueror and builder. He led military campaigns into Nubia and Libya, securing gold, cattle, and captives, and expanded trade routes that brought cedar wood from Lebanon and turquoise from Sinai. With Egypt's wealth at his command, he pursued the perfection of pyramid design with relentless vision. Sneferu's first attempt, the Midim Pyramid, began as a step pyramid, but was later transformed into smooth sides, an engineering challenge that ultimately failed when the outer casing collapsed. Undeterred, he ordered a new pyramid at Dashur, the Bent Pyramid. During construction, its steep angle was abruptly reduced halfway up, giving it its distinctive shape. This adjustment was not aesthetic but practical. The builders had learned from dangerous cracks in the core masonry. Finally, Sneferu completed the Red Pyramid, also at Dashur, with a stable and graceful design that stands today as Egypt's first true smooth-sided pyramid. The lessons of Sneferu's reign went beyond architecture. His reign exemplified the pharaoh's role as both provider and protector, a ruler whose building projects employed thousands and reaffirmed the divine order of Ma'at. The resources required for these immense works, from quarrying stone to organizing labor, revealed the full capability of Egypt's administration. It was a civilization capable of directing tens of thousands of workers in perfect coordination, fed and supplied by a state that managed every detail. The achievements of Sneferu's son, Khufu, would surpass even these triumphs. Around 2580 BCE, Khufu ordered the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza, the most astonishing monument of the ancient world. Rising originally to a height of 146 meters, built from more than 2.3 million limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, it required a workforce that modern estimates place between 20,000 and 30,000 skilled laborers, craftsmen, and seasonal workers. Contrary to old myths, these were not slaves but laborers organized in rotating crews, supported by state-run bakeries, breweries, and medical teams. Recent discoveries at Giza's workers' village confirm the existence of a well-fed, disciplined labor force, men who took pride in serving the living God. The precision of the Great Pyramid is staggering. Its sides are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal points, its base level to within a few centimeters. The internal chambers, the King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber, and Grand Gallery, reflect mathematical and symbolic precision, embodying both celestial order and spiritual ascent. To later Egyptians, Khufu's monument represented the ultimate merging of heaven and earth, the eternal house of the king's soul. Khufu's successors continued the legacy at Giza. His son Khafre built the second pyramid, slightly smaller but raised on higher ground to appear equal in majesty. In front of his pyramid, He commissioned a colossal guardian, the Great Sphinx. Carved from the limestone bedrock, the Sphinx bore the king's features on a lion's body, symbolizing strength and divine guardianship. Nearby, Menkaure erected the third and smallest pyramid, renowned for its elegant proportions and surviving casing of red granite. Together, these three pyramids and their mortuary temples formed a sacred landscape aligned with the stars of Orion's belt, a celestial mirror of eternity. This golden age of pyramid building extended far beyond architecture. The Fourth Dynasty kings ruled from Memphis with authority that reached every corner of the two lands. Trade flourished along the Nile. Gold poured in from Nubia, and expeditions to Sinai secured copper and turquoise for the crown. The central government maintained strict control over agriculture, directing irrigation and collecting surplus grain to feed the massive workforce. Egypt's art achieved new heights of refinement. Serene statues of kings, elegant tomb reliefs, and vivid wall paintings depicted a world in perfect harmony. The royal court became the heart of Egypt's social order. Nobles, officials, and priests served the king in exchange for land and titles. High officials were buried in elaborate mastaba tombs near the royal necropolises, their walls inscribed with scenes of daily life, plowing, fishing, banqueting, that reveal a society both prosperous and orderly. These scenes were not mere decoration, but magical images meant to ensure the continuation of earthly pleasures in the afterlife. Religion during the Old Kingdom centered on the sun god Ra, whose worship grew alongside that of the divine pharaoh. The king was seen as the son of Ra, and the daily journey of the sun across the sky mirrored the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The pyramid texts, the earliest known religious writings, began to appear in the late Old Kingdom, inscribed on the walls of royal tombs at Saqqara. They were spells and hymns designed to guide the king's soul through the afterlife and unite him with the eternal sun. By the Fifth Dynasty, circa 2494 to 2345 BCE, Egypt's wealth and ideology had reached maturity. Kings such as Sahur and Neferurker continued pyramid construction, but also built magnificent sun temples at Abu Ghirab, emphasizing Ra's central role. Trade networks expanded even further. Egyptian ships reached the distant land of Punt, bringing back incense, gold, and exotic animals. Reliefs from this era depict the bustling docks of ancient ports, filled with goods from Africa and the Near East. Egypt was the economic and spiritual hub of its world. Yet beneath the perfection, cracks began to show. As pyramids multiplied, their construction became smaller and less precise, reflecting the strain on resources. The vast amount of labor and wealth required to maintain these projects began to burden the state. Meanwhile, the growing power of regional governors, known as nomarchs, created a challenge to royal authority. These officials managed local affairs, collected taxes, and built their own tombs, which in time rivaled those of the nobility at the capital. The Sixth Dynasty, circa 2345 to 2181 BCE, marked the last great phase of the Old Kingdom. King Teti inaugurated the dynasty, followed by Pepi I and Pepi II. Pepi I's long reign saw attempts to maintain central control through marriages and appointments, while military expeditions continued into Nubia and the Levant. Under Pepi II, who ruled for an extraordinary span, perhaps over 90 years, the royal authority that had once seemed eternal began to weaken. Inscriptions from Pepi-II's officials reveal growing independence among local rulers. Provincial tombs became increasingly elaborate, suggesting that wealth and influence had shifted away from Memphis. The bureaucracy that had once unified Egypt now functioned more like a collection of semi-autonomous estates. Famine, possibly triggered by low Nile floods and climate instability, compounded the crisis. Texts like the Admonitions of Epure, written later but recalling this time, describe a land in disorder. The river is dry, and men thirst. The storehouse is bare, and robbers plunder. Whether literal or symbolic, such words reflect a breakdown of Ma'at, the divine order that had sustained Egypt's greatness. By 2181 BCE, the Old Kingdom had collapsed. The once mighty central government dissolved as local rulers declared independence. The pyramids still stood gleaming in the desert, symbols of divine kingship, but their meaning had dimmed in the shadow of chaos. Egypt entered a dark age, the first intermediate period, when the unity forged by Narmer and glorified by Khufu was lost to time. The age of the pyramid builders had achieved wonders no civilization had attempted before: mastery of stone, organization of labor, and a vision of eternity made visible. Yet the very system that built the pyramids had sown the seeds of its own decline. As wealth and faith poured into stone monuments, the human fabric of the kingdom began to fray. The world's first great civilization had reached its summit, and from that height, the descent would be as profound as its rise. When the pyramids ceased to rise along the western desert, and the voices that once sang hymns of eternal kings fell silent, Egypt entered one of its most uncertain ages. The grandeur of the Old Kingdom had depended on centralized authority, divine kingship, and a stable flow of wealth along the Nile. Yet by around 2181 BCE, that unity fractured. The long reign of Pepi-II, the last great king of the 6th dynasty, had stretched nearly 90 years. His age left behind not continuity, but weakness. As he grew older, officials, priests, and provincial governors, the nomarchs, gained power. The court at Memphis lost its grip, and Egypt drifted toward political disintegration. The river that had once symbolized abundance now brought misery. The annual flood, upon which all life in Egypt depended, began to falter. Archaeological studies and ancient writings suggest cycles of famine struck the land, possibly linked to climate change or low Nile inundations. The prosperity that once sustained the pyramid builders vanished. Granaries emptied, and the old system of redistribution collapsed. Without a strong central authority, each region turned inward. Nomarchs fortified their cities, raised local armies, and governed as semi-independent lords. What had been one kingdom dissolved into a patchwork of warring states. The Egyptians themselves preserved memories of this dark transformation. The Admonitions of Epure, written centuries later, recall the world turned upside down, where servants became masters, nobles wandered hungry, and chaos replaced order. One lament read, "The river is blood, and men shrink from tasting it. Men thirst for water, and none can find it." Though poetic and exaggerated, it captured the horror of losing Ma'at, the divine balance between order and chaos that defined Egyptian civilization. This loss of Ma'at was more than political. It was spiritual. Pharaohs were seen as the embodiment of gods on earth, responsible for maintaining harmony between heaven and the Nile. When the throne became powerless, it seemed to Egyptians that the gods themselves had turned away. Temples decayed, tombs were robbed, and offerings ceased. Inscriptions in provincial tombs tell of famine, violence, and self-reliance. Local lords boasting not of their loyalty to the king, but of feeding the hungry and protecting their towns. Egypt's unity had dissolved, but its people endured, holding on to fragments of their old faith amid collapse. Yet, even in this age of despair, civilization did not vanish. Archaeological evidence from sites like Asiut, Heracleopolis, and Thebes shows continued craftsmanship, local administration, and religious life. These centers became small kingdoms, each claiming to represent the rightful continuation of Egypt's legacy. In the north, Heracleopolis Magna, modern in Asia, emerged as a stronghold of authority under rulers who founded what later historians called the 9th and 10th dynasties. These kings attempted to revive order, though their control rarely extended beyond the Fayum and parts of Middle Egypt. Their inscriptions invoke divine legitimacy, showing that even weak kings continued to claim the sacred mantle of Horus. Meanwhile, to the south, a rival power arose at Thebes. Once a provincial town at the edge of Upper Egypt, Thebes began to flourish under local rulers who traced their lineage to the 11th dynasty. They built modest temples to Ammonius and Montu, gods of war and renewal, and organized their territories with discipline. The Thebans developed a sense of resilience that would later shape Egypt's rebirth. Conflict between the northern kings of Heracleopolis and the southern princes of Thebes eventually defined this era. Tomb scenes from Theban nobles like Antiphon, a powerful local governor, reveal both ambition and hardship. Antiphon's inscriptions boast of feeding his people when others starved and defending his nome against rival regions. He wrote, "All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger, yet I did not allow anyone to die of hunger in this nome." His words reflect a time when morality replaced central law, and regional leaders had to embody Ma'at themselves. As the decades passed, struggles between the north and south intensified. Armies clashed along the Nile, leaving behind fortifications and burned settlements. Still, even amid warfare, Egyptian culture adapted rather than disappeared. Art, though simpler, remained distinctly Egyptian. Funerary customs persisted, offering food and figurines to the dead, invoking Osiris, the god of resurrection. The coffin texts, inscribed on wooden sarcophagi, replaced the pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom. They democratized religious access, allowing ordinary officials, not just kings, to claim a place in the afterlife. This spiritual transformation, the belief that salvation was not limited to royalty, would become a defining feature of the Middle Kingdom and later ages. The weakening of royal authority also encouraged experimentation in literature and thought. The so-called wisdom texts, such as the instruction for King Menaker, written by a ruler of Heracleopolis to his son, revealed deep reflection on leadership and justice. Menaker's advice warned against cruelty and urged compassion, showing how rulers, even in decline, sought to preserve ideals of good governance. This text stands as one of Egypt's earliest philosophical writings, expressing regret for civil strife and longing for divine harmony. By the late First Intermediate Period, around 2100 BCE, the tide began to turn in favor of the southern Thebans. Their kings, Intef I, Intef II, and Intef III, expanded their control northward, capturing strategic cities along the Nile. They adopted royal titles, depicted themselves wearing the double crown, and inscribed their names within cartouches, symbols once reserved for the pharaohs of old. Their growing power rested not on monumental construction or vast wealth, but on loyalty, military discipline, and a renewed devotion to Amun-Isare, the sun god who would soon dominate Egypt's theology. At Thebes, a cultural and religious revival took shape. Temples were rebuilt, and priests performed rituals to restore divine favor. The Egyptians had always believed that the land's prosperity mirrored the state of its ruler's soul. Thus, the Theban kings sought to heal both the nation and its cosmic order. Art from this period shows a return to idealized forms, calm faces, symmetrical postures, and careful inscriptions, reflecting a desire for stability after generations of disorder. The decisive moment came under Mentuhotep II, son of Intef III. Around 2060 BCE, he inherited a divided kingdom but possessed both ambition and vision. From Thebes, he launched a campaign northward against the Heracleopolitan rulers. Inscriptions and reliefs from his mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari record his victories and his self-image as a unifier. After years of conflict, around 2055 BCE, Mentuhotep II triumphed. He marched into the Delta, reunified Upper and Lower Egypt, and proclaimed himself king of the two lands. His reign marked the end of the first intermediate period and the dawn of the Middle Kingdom. Mentuhotep's unification was more than a political conquest. It was a spiritual restoration. He revived ancient festivals, reopened temples, and reinstated the rituals that linked the pharaoh to the gods. His mortuary temple, built into the cliffs of western Thebes, symbolized a fusion of heaven, earth, and eternity. Its terraces and colonnades foreshadowed later New Kingdom architecture, showing that even in recovery, Egyptian art reached new heights. Under Mentuhotep, Egypt's institutions were rebuilt. The royal bureaucracy, once shattered, was reorganized with local governors brought under tighter supervision. The economy recovered as the Nile floods returned to normal patterns. Grain storage, taxation, and trade resumed, restoring prosperity. The king's image, after centuries of decline, once again became a symbol of divine justice. His official titles, Son of Ra, Lord of the Crowns, He who brings peace to the two lands, echoed the ancient ideals of the Old Kingdom, but with a deeper understanding of human fragility. Archaeological remains from his reign reveal the careful rebuilding of infrastructure, canals, granaries, and roads connecting Upper and Lower Egypt. Trade routes reopened to Nubia in the south, bringing gold, ivory, and incense. To the northeast, caravans once more reached the Sinai for copper and turquoise. The land that had been torn by famine and rivalry began to heal. The unification achieved by Mentuhotep II also brought a profound psychological transformation. The Egyptians had witnessed their world fall apart, and in rebuilding it, they developed a new consciousness about impermanence and resilience. Their literature of the Middle Kingdom reflects this, an introspective tone, emphasizing wisdom, humility, and the fleeting nature of life. This introspection grew directly out of the traumas of the first intermediate period. Thus, from the ashes of collapse, Egypt entered one of its most thoughtful ages. The ideals of Ma'at, once embodied only by divine kings, now resonated in the lives of ordinary people. Officials spoke of moral duty. Craftsmen carved scenes of daily life instead of mere royal grandeur. The lessons learned from chaos shaped Egypt's rebirth, an understanding that power without justice led only to ruin. By the time Mentuhotep II died, Egypt was whole again. The crown once more bore the red and white symbols of the two lands. The temples sang hymns to the gods, and the scribes recorded the deeds of a new age. But the memory of the dark years lingered. It would remind every pharaoh to come that the Nile's blessings could vanish, and that the greatest pyramid of all was not made of stone, but of balance, justice, and the will to endure. After centuries of turmoil, Egypt stood once more united under the 11th dynasty. The long struggle of the first intermediate period had scarred the land, but it had also taught resilience. Mentuhotep II, the unifier, had done more than bring the two lands together. He had restored faith in divine kingship and the concept of Ma'at, the cosmic order that held heaven and earth in harmony. What followed was an age of recovery and renewal. The Middle Kingdom, remembered as a time when Egypt's heart beat strong again, and its people redefined what it meant to be Egyptian. The 11th dynasty began its rule from Thebes, the city that had risen to prominence during Egypt's fragmentation. The Theban kings, especially Mentuhotep II and his successors, re-established the bureaucracy that had collapsed with the Old Kingdom. They appointed trusted officials, organized taxation, and restored control over local governors who had acted as independent rulers during the years of chaos. Tomb inscriptions from this era show a renewed sense of loyalty to the pharaoh, a stark contrast to the self-praise of the nomarchs during the previous period. The crown was once again the center of the world. Mentuhotep II's temple at Deir el-Bahari embodied the Middle Kingdom's spirit. Built against the cliffs of western Thebes, its terraces and colonnades fused the power of nature with architectural precision. It was both a statement of divine right and human order, an early hint of the monumental style that would later define New Kingdom Thebes. After Mentuhotep's death, his successors, including Mentuhotep III and IV, continued the process of rebuilding Egypt's institutions. They sent expeditions to the quarries of Wadi Hammamat and reopened trade routes through the eastern desert. The inscriptions left by these missions record the reemergence of a confident, organized state that once again sought the wealth of distant lands. Around 1985 BCE, a powerful official named Amenemhat rose to prominence. Originally a vizier under the 11th dynasty, he seized power and founded the 12th dynasty, marking the true beginning of the Middle Kingdom's golden age. Amenemhat I moved the capital from Thebes northward to a new city called Ichtai, near the Fayum. The move was strategic, centrally located between Upper and Lower Egypt. Ichtai symbolized unity and allowed tighter control over the provinces. From here, Amenemhat reorganized the state's administration, reasserting royal authority over nomarchs who had once wielded near-kingly power. The 12th dynasty kings were pragmatic rulers. They did not build pyramids to reach the heavens like their old kingdom ancestors, but rather to symbolize order and continuity. Amenemhat I constructed his pyramid at Lisht, close to Memphis, reviving the ancient royal necropolis. Yet the focus of this age was not grandeur, but governance. The state became more bureaucratic, with scribes and administrators recording every detail of production, taxation, and trade. The pharaoh's authority extended into every province through appointed governors and overseers, reducing the autonomy that had caused previous fragmentation. Literature from this period reveals an Egypt that had matured after centuries of hardship. The instruction of Amenemhat, written after the king's assassination and framed as advice from the deceased ruler to his son Senusret I, blends wisdom and realism. Trust not a brother, no, not a friend. It warns, a reflection of Amenemhat's turbulent reign. This text, along with works like the Tale of Sinew, marked the birth of Egyptian narrative literature. Sinew tells of a courtier who flees Egypt upon hearing of the king's death, lives among foreign tribes, and longs for home until he is finally welcomed back by the new pharaoh. It captures themes of exile, loyalty, and redemption, deeply human concerns born from Egypt's long struggle for unity. Senusret I, who succeeded Amenemhat I, strengthened Egypt's borders and restored its prosperity. He expanded into Nubia, building fortresses along the Nile to control gold mines and trade routes. At Buhin, Semna, and Urinardi, his military engineers constructed massive mud brick walls, garrisons, and watchtowers. These forts were not only defensive outposts, but also symbols of Egyptian order extending into foreign lands. Senusret's reign also saw an explosion of temple building. He restored shrines to the gods across the country, especially to Ammonius at Thebes, signaling the growing prominence of this once local deity. The cult of Ammonius would later dominate Egyptian religion, merging with the sun god Ra to form Ammonius Ra, king of the gods. Senusret's successors, Amenemhat II, Senusret II, and Senusret III, continued to strengthen the kingdom. Amenemhat II encouraged international trade, sending expeditions to Byblos in modern Lebanon for cedar wood and to Punt for incense and exotic goods. His reign marks one of the earliest records of diplomatic and commercial contact between Egypt and the wider Near East. Senusret II turned his attention inward, focusing on domestic prosperity. He began one of Egypt's greatest irrigation projects in the Fayum Basin, diverting Nile water through canals to reclaim fertile farmland. Archaeologists have identified remains of these works, embankments and channels that expanded Egypt's agricultural wealth and symbolized its mastery over nature. Senusret III stands as one of the most powerful figures of the Middle Kingdom. His face, depicted in statues, departs from the calm perfection of earlier kings. Deep lines, heavy eyelids, and stern expressions portray him as a ruler burdened by responsibility, a realist, not a god. His military campaigns into Nubia were decisive, pushing Egypt's border as far south as the Second Cataract. He crushed revolts, built massive fortifications, and imposed strict control over trade and tribute. Yet, at home, he reorganized the government to reduce local power, dividing Egypt into administrative regions directly under royal supervision. His reforms laid the foundation for 2 centuries of internal stability. The Middle Kingdom was not only an age of kings and conquests, but of cultural refinement. Egyptian art became more expressive, moving beyond rigid Old Kingdom forms. Sculptures showed individuality. Literature explored inner thoughts. Architecture reflected balance rather than sheer scale. Tomb paintings of officials depicted scenes of daily life. Farming, fishing, weaving, capturing a realism that mirrored Egypt's renewed humanism. The Egyptians no longer saw their world as eternal perfection, but as a fragile order to be preserved through wisdom and justice. Amenemhat III, who reigned for nearly 45 years, presided over Egypt's greatest prosperity. His projects in the Fayum transformed it into a center of agriculture and settlement. The labyrinth, a vast administrative and ceremonial complex near his pyramid at Hira, impressed ancient travelers. Herodotus, writing centuries later, described it as more wondrous than the pyramids themselves. Amenemhat III also continued his predecessor's mining and trading expeditions to the turquoise mines of Sinai, the quarries of Nubia, and the oases of the western desert. His reign represents the peak of Middle Kingdom power and wealth. Under his successor, Amenemhat IV, and the female pharaoh Sobekneferu, the first woman confirmed to rule Egypt in her own right, the 12th dynasty came to an end around 1800 BCE. Sobekneferu's reign was brief but notable. She ruled as daughter of Ra, maintaining order in a time of transition, and her name appears in records as a legitimate pharaoh. Her reign closed a glorious chapter of Egypt's history, but the structures that had upheld the Middle Kingdom began to weaken. The 13th dynasty inherited an empire stretched thin by its own complexity. Dozens of kings ruled in rapid succession, many for only a few years. Central authority weakened as competing factions rose within the court. The bureaucratic machine, once Egypt's strength, became heavy and inefficient. Local governors regained autonomy, and records show growing instability in the Delta region. Yet even in decline, Egypt retained its dignity. Temples remained active, scribes continued their work, and craftsmen built modest but refined tombs. Meanwhile, to the northeast, a new and unfamiliar presence appeared in the land. Groups of settlers from Western Asia, traders, herders, and migrants, began moving into the eastern delta. They brought with them new technologies, bronze tools, improved pottery, and, eventually, the horse-drawn chariot. These people, known later as the Hyksos, came not as conquerors at first, but as immigrants. Egypt, weakened by internal decline, absorbed them without resistance. Over time, their influence grew. They learned Egyptian customs, worshipped local gods, and established their own centers of power in the north. In Upper Egypt, Thebes remained a bastion of traditional rule. Its governors maintained a degree of independence and continued to honor the ancient gods. Yet as the 13th and 14th dynasties overlapped and fragmented, Egypt's unity slipped away again. Inscriptions and archaeological layers from this period show increasing disorganization. Trade routes faltered, the administration thinned, and the central treasury dwindled. By around 1650 BCE, the fragile balance broke completely. The Hyksos seized power in the Delta, founding their capital at Avaris and establishing what would be remembered as the 15th dynasty. They introduced military innovations, bronze weaponry, the composite bow, and the chariot, which would forever change Egyptian warfare. Their rise marked the beginning of the Second Intermediate Period, an age of foreign dominance and renewed struggle. Still, the centuries of the Middle Kingdom left an indelible mark. Egypt had not only recovered from its first great collapse, but had reinvented itself. The bureaucracy, literature, and ideology developed during this time would define Egypt for the rest of its ancient history. The idea of the pharaoh as a just ruler, not a distant god but a shepherd of his people, was born in this era. The art and texts of the Middle Kingdom, infused with empathy and introspection, reflected a civilization that had learned from suffering and had mastered the rhythm of renewal. As the Middle Kingdom faded into uncertainty, Egypt once again faced division. But its foundations were stronger than before. The memory of unity remained, and in Thebes, the descendants of proud warrior priests began to stir. From the banks of the southern Nile, a new dynasty would soon rise, one that would drive out the foreigners, reclaim Egypt's honor, and forge an empire that reached beyond its deserts to the world beyond the horizon. As the twilight of the Middle Kingdom dimmed, Egypt drifted toward disunity. The once strong central government fractured under the weight of too many kings and too few resources. Local rulers reclaimed independence, trade slowed, and the vast bureaucratic system that had sustained the 12th dynasty no longer held the country together. Into this weakened land came new peoples, migrants and traders from the northeast who settled in the fertile plains of the eastern delta. Over time, these settlers would reshape Egypt's destiny. They were the Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, known later as the Hyksos. The Hyksos did not arrive as conquerors. Archaeological evidence suggests their early presence in Egypt was peaceful, part of a gradual movement of Semitic-speaking peoples from Canaan and Syria into the Delta. They traded livestock, metals, and pottery, blending with local communities. Yet as Egypt's native rulers faltered, the newcomers gained influence. They adopted Egyptian customs, names, and gods, creating a fusion of cultures. But when the central authority collapsed completely, they stepped into the power vacuum. Around 1650 BCE, they seized control of the north and founded a new capital at Avaris in the eastern delta, establishing what Egyptologists call the 15th dynasty. The Hyksos were foreign in origin, but Egyptian in ambition. Their rulers bore titles of pharaoh, wore royal crowns, and claimed divine favor. The most prominent among them was Apipi, Apophis, who reigned during the height of Hyksos power. His court at Avaris was cosmopolitan, filled with foreign merchants, warriors, and artisans. Excavations there have uncovered Canaanite-style temples, bronze weapons, and imported pottery. The Hyksos introduced new technologies that would transform Egypt's military: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, and advanced bronze weaponry. The chariot, swift and maneuverable, gave them an advantage over the infantry-based Egyptian armies that had not yet mastered this innovation. While the north fell under Hyksos control, Egypt's south remained independent. The Theban kings of the 17th dynasty ruled from their ancient city on the Nile, continuing the traditions of the Middle Kingdom. They were pharaohs in name, but their power was limited to Upper Egypt. The border between north and south fluctuated, with the two realms often engaging in diplomacy, trade, and occasional conflict. Despite the political division, both sides acknowledged the Nile's shared heritage. Inscriptions suggest a cautious coexistence at first, perhaps bound by economic need. The Hyksos controlled the delta's trade routes to Asia, while Thebes maintained access to Nubia's gold and southern resources. For nearly a century, this uneasy balance endured, yet resentment simmered beneath the surface. The Theban kings saw themselves as guardians of true Egyptian culture, viewing the Hyksos as usurpers who polluted the land with foreign gods and customs. The Hyksos, in turn, looked down upon the Thebans as provincial and weak. Ancient texts preserve echoes of this tension. The quarrel of Apophis and Sekenenra, a tale preserved in later manuscripts, tells of a Hyksos king who sent a message to the Theban ruler demanding that he silence the hippopotami in his pool because their noise disturbed his sleep hundreds of miles away in Avaris, a metaphor for the arrogance and provocation that would ignite war. The spark came during the reign of Sekenenra, a Theban king whose mummy bears horrific wounds, blows to the skull from Hyksos weapons. His death likely occurred in battle or during an ambush, the earliest physical evidence of open warfare between the two realms. Seqenenra's courage became legend, and his sons continued the struggle. His successor Camos carried the fight northward, determined to drive the foreigners from Egypt. Camos' campaigns are recorded on two remarkable stelae discovered at Thebes. They reveal a proud and defiant tone, describing how he attacked the Hyksos border fortresses, seized enemy ships, and cut off their communications with allies in Nubia. "I shall squeeze the delta like a bird trapped in my hand," Camos proclaimed. He portrayed the war not as a conquest, but as liberation, the restoration of Ma'at, order, to a land defiled by chaos. His victories were limited, yet they reignited Egyptian unity under the banner of resistance. Camos died before completing the war, but his younger brother, Ahmose, took up the mantle. When he ascended the throne, Egypt's situation remained precarious. The Hyksos still held the delta, and to the south, the Nubians, once Egypt's trading partners, had allied with the northern rulers. Ahmose proved to be a brilliant military leader and strategist. He reorganized his army, adopting Hyksos technology to fight the Hyksos themselves. His forces now used chariots and bronze weapons, closing the technological gap that had once doomed Egyptian armies. The liberation struggle lasted years, marked by sieges, raids, and naval battles along the Nile. The Ahmose, son of Abana, inscriptions carved on the walls of a tomb at El Kab provide a vivid first-hand account. Abana, a naval officer who fought under Ahmose, described storming fortified towns, capturing prisoners, and witnessing the fall of Avaris, the Hyksos capital. These records are rare glimpses into Egypt's earliest recorded military campaigns, written not by kings, but by soldiers who lived through them. Ahmose's final assault on Avaris was decisive. The city fell after fierce fighting, and the remnants of the Hyksos fled east into Canaan. The Egyptians pursued them as far as Sharuhin, a fortified city in southern Palestine, which Ahmose besieged for 3 years before taking it by storm. With that victory, Egypt's foreign occupiers were annihilated or driven from its borders. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose declared Egypt reunited, a moment as monumental as Narmer's unification 15 centuries earlier. But Ahmose did not stop at liberation. The trauma of foreign domination had reshaped Egypt's worldview. The Thebans understood that isolation no longer guaranteed safety. To prevent another invasion, Egypt would now project its power beyond its borders. Ahmose reorganized the army into a permanent, professional force and began campaigns south into Nubia, reclaiming lost lands and establishing military colonies. He also reopened trade routes to the Near East and re-established control over valuable resources: gold, copper, timber, and incense. At home, Ahmose embarked on reconstruction. Temples destroyed during the wars were rebuilt, including those of Ammonius at Thebes and Ptah at Memphis. He restored the land grants and festivals that had lapsed under Hyksos rule. His reign marks the dawn of the 18th dynasty and the beginning of the New Kingdom, Egypt's imperial age. Yet in this victory lay a transformation deeper than politics or war. The Egyptians had emerged from their second dark age with a hardened sense of identity and purpose. The reunified state looked south and east with new ambition. The wealth of Nubia's mines and the trade routes of the Levant beckoned. Egypt's generals, veterans of the Hyksos wars, were seasoned and loyal, their sons ready to follow. The pharaoh's army had evolved into an instrument of empire, but Ahmose reforms extended beyond the battlefield. His administration re-established the hierarchy of officials, viziers, treasurers, and high priests, ensuring the crown's authority reached every province. To reward loyalty, he granted lands and titles to his soldiers, binding them to the throne through privilege and gratitude. Ahmose's wife, Queen Ahmose Nefertari, played an equally significant role in restoring royal prestige. Revered as God's wife of Ammonius, she became a symbol of divine partnership in rule, a powerful queen and high priestess who represented the union of the throne and the gods. Her image, preserved in statues and tomb reliefs, became a model for later queens of Egypt's Golden Age. In the generation after Ahmose, Egypt's reconstruction continued under his successors, Amenhotep I and Thutmose I. Amenhotep consolidated the kingdom and began the great building programs that would define the new kingdom as majesty. He founded new temples at Thebes and reorganized the workforce of artisans at Deir el-Medina, the same community that would later carve the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Thutmose I expanded Egypt's borders beyond anything his ancestors had achieved. Marching south, he campaigned deep into Nubia, reaching the Fourth Cataract and building forts to secure gold mines. To the northeast, he crossed into Syria, marking Egypt's first thrust into Asia. His victories announced to the ancient world that Egypt was no longer a land content with its river. It had become an empire builder. These expansions were possible because of the reforms initiated during the Hyksos Wars. The adoption of the chariot and the composite bow, once foreign technologies, became essential elements of Egyptian warfare. Bronze replaced copper in weapons and tools, making the army more formidable and productive. The state's control over resource extraction in Sinai and Nubia ensured a steady flow of metals, enriching the crown and temple alike. The Hyksos period, though brief in Egyptian chronology, left lasting marks on culture and identity. The trauma of foreign rule instilled a deep-seated fear of disunity and an enduring mistrust of outsiders. Egyptian religion absorbed and reinterpreted foreign influences. Baal became associated with Set, the god of chaos, while Astarte and Anat found places within the Egyptian pantheon as warrior goddesses. In art and architecture, motifs of storm and struggle emerged, symbolic of a civilization that had endured invasion and reclaimed its sovereignty. Politically, the lessons of the Second Intermediate Period reshaped the state. The new pharaohs no longer relied solely on divine authority, but on organized military strength and efficient administration. Temples of Ammonius at Thebes grew in power, supported by royal patronage. Ammonius, the hidden god who rose with Thebes, became Egypt's supreme deity, his favor seen as essential for the maintenance of Ma'at. The king was no longer just a divine ruler. He was the chosen instrument of Ammonius' will. By the time of Thutmose I, Egypt stood poised on the edge of transformation. The scars of occupation had healed into hardened resolve. The Hyksos had taught Egypt to look beyond its borders, to command the lands that once threatened it. The Nile no longer marked the limit of the pharaoh's realm. It was the spine of an empire that would soon stretch from the heart of Africa to the plains of Asia. The age that followed, the New Kingdom, would see the pharaohs become conquerors, diplomats, and builders of wonders that would stand for millennia. The struggle that began in the swamps of the Delta and the deserts of Thebes had not only reclaimed Egypt as freedom, but had given birth to an empire. The Hyksos, though erased from Egyptian monuments, had changed Egypt forever. The tools they brought, the wars they provoked, and the unity they inadvertently inspired shaped the next 5 centuries of Egyptian greatness. As the Hyksos vanished from the Delta, their memory lingered, a shadow warning against weakness, a lesson etched into the soul of a nation that would now march beneath the banner of the sun. Egypt had been reborn through fire, and the empire of the pharaohs was about to rise from its ashes. The fall of the Hyksos marked more than the reunification of Egypt. It ignited the birth of an empire. From the southern sands of Nubia to the distant frontiers of Syria, Egypt now saw itself not merely as a kingdom of the Nile, but as the center of a world meant to be ordered under its rule. The new kingdom, spanning the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties, became a period of unprecedented expansion, artistic brilliance, and divine kingship. Pharaohs were no longer caretakers of Ma'at alone. They were conquerors, builders, and symbols of cosmic dominion. When Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos and founded the 18th dynasty, he restructured Egypt from the ground up. The old provincial governors who once wielded semi-independent power were replaced by royal officials directly answerable to the crown. The temples of Thebes, particularly those of Ammonius, were elevated to immense wealth and authority. The cult of Ammonius Ra, merging the hidden god Ammonius with the solar deity Ra, became the theological foundation of the empire. The pharaoh stood as the son of Ammonius, divine in birth and chosen by heaven to rule all lands touched by the sun's rays. Ahmose's successors continued his vision. Amenhotep I stabilized the realm and fostered an age of peace and internal development. He expanded the royal necropolis at Thebes, introducing the Valley of the Kings as the new resting place of divine rulers. Unlike the pyramids of old, these tombs were hidden in the cliffs of western Thebes, a strategic choice to protect the royal dead from tomb robbers. The art of tomb construction and decoration reached new sophistication. Painters and stonecutters of Deir el-Medina filled the walls with scenes of daily life, mythic journeys, and divine judgment, capturing the Egyptian vision of eternity with precision and color. Thutmose I, Amenhotep's successor, extended Egypt's borders further than ever before. To the south, he led military campaigns deep into Nubia, establishing control up to the Fourth Cataract. Fortresses and garrisons ensured Egypt's dominance over the gold-rich region, whose wealth became the lifeblood of imperial ambition. To the northeast, Thutmose I led expeditions across the Sinai into Syria, bringing tribute from foreign princes. His exploits were commemorated on temple walls at Karnak, where hieroglyphs proclaimed his might as the smiter of foreign lands. Egypt had become a power recognized and feared across the Near East. After Thutmose I's death, the throne passed briefly to Thutmose II, and upon his early death, his queen, Hatshepsut, assumed power as regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III. But Hatshepsut's regency soon evolved into full kingship. She took on all the titles and symbols of a pharaoh, even portraying herself in male form with the royal false beard. Her reign, though often overshadowed by controversy in later records, was one of peace, prosperity, and architectural grandeur. Hatshepsut's genius lay in diplomacy and construction rather than conquest. She reopened trade networks lost during the Hyksos Wars and launched a legendary expedition to the land of Punt, a distant region believed to lie along the Horn of Africa. Reliefs at her mortuary temple in Deir el-Bahri depict ships laden with incense, ebony, gold, and exotic animals. The temple itself, built against the cliffs of western Thebes, stands as one of the masterpieces of Egyptian architecture. Terraced colonnades, sanctuaries, and ramps embody a harmony between landscape and divinity unmatched in the ancient world. Under Hatshepsut, art and administration flourished. She appointed trusted officials like Senenmut, her chief architect and steward, who oversaw monumental projects throughout Egypt. Her reign also saw the consolidation of the Ammonius priesthood's power, a partnership that strengthened both throne and temple. Though her portrayal as a female pharaoh was unprecedented, it reinforced the idea that kingship was a divine function transcending gender. Upon her death, Thutmose III ascended the throne as sole ruler. His reign transformed Egypt into a true empire. Military records preserved on the walls of Karnak chronicle his 17 campaigns in Asia, a level of sustained warfare unmatched in Egyptian history. His first and most famous battle occurred at Megiddo, where he led his troops through a narrow mountain pass to surprise a coalition of Canaanite kings. The victory was total. Megiddo fell, and with it, control of the northern trade routes. Thutmose's generals meticulously recorded every detail, including the capture of thousands of prisoners and immense spoils. Thutmose III's campaigns extended Egyptian influence beyond Canaan into Syria and as far north as the Euphrates River. He received tribute from foreign kings, established garrisons, and installed loyal vassals to secure Egypt's supremacy. Through conquest and diplomacy, Egypt became the preeminent power of the Near East. The flow of tribute, gold, ivory, lapis lazuli, cedar, and exotic animals enriched the temples of Ammonius and filled the royal treasury. Yet Thutmose III was not merely a warrior. He was a patron of learning and art. His reign saw advancements in sculpture, metallurgy, and record-keeping. The temples of Karnak expanded under his direction, and new festivals honored Ammonius' role as divine protector of the empire. The blending of religious authority and military success solidified the ideology that Egypt's expansion was not conquest, but divine order, at extending into foreign lands. When Thutmose III died, Egypt stood at the height of its power. His son, Amenhotep II, maintained the empire through strong military leadership and punitive expeditions against rebellious vassals. The empire's wealth and stability continued under Thutmose IV and then reached an apex under Amenhotep III, whose reign, circa 1390 to 1353 BC, represented the golden age of peace and prosperity. Amenhotep III ruled not as a conqueror, but as a divine monarch presiding over an empire at its zenith. His court in Thebes became a center of international diplomacy. Letters from foreign rulers, preserved in the Amarna archives, describe alliances, marriages, and exchanges of luxury goods between Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and Hutti. The pharaoh was addressed as an equal among kings, though treated with reverence as the sun king of the ancient world. His reign's wealth poured into construction. The massive temple of Luxor, dedicated to Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu, rose on the east bank of Thebes. The temple complex at Karnak expanded with towering pylons and colossal statues. The mortuary temple of Amenhotep III, once the largest in Thebes, was guarded by the two immense colossi of Memnon, statues that still stand today. Amenhotep III's building projects symbolized not just devotion but divine embodiment. He styled himself as a living god, merging with Ammonius Ra and the sun's eternal power. Festivals of Sed, traditionally celebrated after 30 years of rule, were held multiple times to reaffirm his vitality. The art of this period reflected refinement and elegance, serene faces, delicate proportions, and attention to detail that mirrored the calm of imperial security. Yet beneath this golden peace lay a subtle transformation in Egypt's spiritual identity. The immense wealth and influence of the Ammonius priesthood began to rival the pharaoh's own power. The temples of Ammonius controlled vast estates, laborers, and treasures. The divine hierarchy that once elevated the king as Ammonius' chosen now risked diminishing him beneath the growing might of the priestly class. This imbalance would soon spark one of Egypt's most radical religious revolutions. When Amenhotep III's son ascended the throne as Amenhotep IV, the balance between king and god shifted. Early in his reign, he introduced a new form of worship centered on Aten, the visible disk of the sun. Rejecting the hidden god Ammonius, Amenhotep IV declared Aten as the sole source of life and divine truth. He changed his name to Akhenaten, he who serves the Aten. The revolution he began reshaped Egypt's religion, art, and even its capital city. Akhenaten's transformation was unprecedented. He built a new capital, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, in Middle Egypt, dedicated entirely to the Aten. The city's temples were open to the sky, allowing sunlight to pour directly onto altars. Inscriptions and reliefs depicted the Aten as a radiant sun whose rays ended in hands offering life to the royal family. Akhenaten and his queen, Nefertiti, were portrayed as the divine intermediaries between the sun and humanity. The artistic style of this era broke sharply with tradition. Figures were rendered with elongated limbs, prominent features, and naturalistic poses. Scenes of the royal family, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters, showed tenderness and intimacy unknown in earlier art. The focus shifted from timeless perfection to human emotion, a reflection of the new theology that placed the royal family at the center of creation. But Akhenaten's revolution was deeply disruptive. The priesthood of Ammonius was stripped of its power, temples closed, and inscriptions erased. Centuries of religious continuity were overturned. The empire, once unified by shared belief and strong administration, began to fracture. Provincial officials and foreign vassals, sensing weakness, withheld tribute. Letters from the Amarna archives revealed desperate pleas from governors in Canaan begging for aid as Hittites and local rivals advanced, pleas that often went unanswered. For nearly 17 years, Akhenaten remained absorbed in his religious vision. His focus on theology overshadowed foreign policy and governance. The empire that Thutmose III had built began to crumble at its edges. Trade slowed, and Egypt's influence in Syria waned. Upon Akhenaten's death, the Aten cult collapsed almost overnight. His successors, Smenkhare and the boy king Tutankhaten, faced the task of restoring order. Tutankhaten, guided by powerful advisors like Ai and General Hormheb, reversed his predecessor's reforms. He changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius, and restored the traditional gods and temples. The capital returned to Thebes, and the cult of Ammonius regained prominence. Though Tutankhamun's reign was short, his restoration of orthodoxy stabilized Egypt and marked the symbolic end of the Amarna heresy. Tutankhamun's tomb, discovered nearly intact in 1922, revealed the opulence of the new kingdom's burial customs: golden shrines, jewelry, chariots, and statues. It offers a rare window into the material world of Egypt's elite, confirming the empire's immense wealth even after political turmoil. After Tutankhamun's early death, power passed to Ai and later to Horemheb, the general who became the last ruler of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb embarked on a campaign of erasure, obliterating the memory of the Amarna period and restoring Egypt's institutions. He reformed the army and administration, punished corrupt officials, and re-established Egypt's dominance abroad. His policies laid the foundation for the 19th dynasty that followed. By the close of the 18th dynasty, Egypt had transformed on every level: political, religious, and cultural. The empire stretched from the Sudanese cataracts to the borders of Anatolia, its wealth drawn from tribute and trade. The kings had evolved from divine shepherds into imperial monarchs. Art and architecture reached heights of grandeur. Religion expanded and contracted with the tides of reform. The pharaohs who followed, the warrior kings of the 19th dynasty, would inherit both the glory and the challenges of this vast empire. Egypt had risen from invasion to become the dominant power of its age. Its armies were trained, its treasuries filled, and its monuments eternal. But maintaining such greatness would demand strength beyond conquest. It would require balance, wisdom, and vigilance in a world growing increasingly complex beyond the Nile's embrace. When the last great pharaohs of the new kingdom faded into memory, Egypt entered a long twilight. The empire that once ruled from the Euphrates to the Fourth Cataract was no more. The wealth of foreign tribute ceased to flow, and the might of the pharaoh was fractured among competing powers. What had once been a single, divine monarchy was now divided between generals, priests, and foreign mercenaries. Historians call this time the Third Intermediate Period, an age marked by political fragmentation, shifting alliances, and foreign influence. Yet, within its chaos, Egyptian culture endured, reshaping itself in response to a world it could no longer control. The collapse began after the death of Ramses XI, the last ruler of the 20th dynasty, around 1070 BCE. In Thebes, the high priests of Ammonius had grown so powerful during the new kingdom that they effectively ruled Upper Egypt as independent monarchs. Smendes, a northern noble, took power in the delta city of Tanis, establishing the 21st dynasty. Egypt, once united by divine kingship, was now split between two centers of authority: Thebes in the south, dominated by priests, and Tanis in the north, led by kings who claimed descent from the Ramessides. Though divided, the country did not descend into anarchy. The two realms coexisted uneasily, maintaining diplomatic relations and shared religious rites. Temples continued to function. Scribes recorded offerings and rituals. The priests of Ammonius in Thebes preserved the spiritual heart of Egypt, while the Tanite kings upheld its outward legitimacy. Yet this delicate balance masked a slow decline. The Nile's resources were no longer enough to sustain two courts. Trade diminished, tombs were looted, and foreign powers pressed at the borders. It was during this period that the famous royal mummies were secretly moved from their plundered tombs in the Valley of the Kings. priests rewrapped the bodies of pharaohs like Ramses II, Seti I, and Thutmose III, hiding them in collective caches at Deir el-Bahri and Amenhotep II's tomb. These burials were acts of reverence and desperation, an attempt to preserve Egypt's sacred ancestors in an age that could no longer protect them. In the Delta, the Tanite kings maintained Egypt's appearance of stability. Sosenzai, one of the early rulers of the 21st dynasty, constructed impressive silver and gold funerary masks and built temples to Ammonius and Mut. His tomb at Tanis, discovered intact in the 20th century, revealed treasures rivaling those of Tutankhamun. But while the art and ritual remained grand, the political reality was smaller. Egypt's influence beyond its borders had vanished. Its vassal states in Canaan and Nubia were independent or ruled by others. Meanwhile, in the western deserts, new forces emerged. Libyan tribes that had settled in Egypt during the late New Kingdom began to rise in prominence. Many had served as mercenaries in Egypt's armies and had married into local families. Over time, they established their own dynasties. By around 945 BCE, Shoshenq I, a Libyan general, seized control of the Delta and founded the 22nd dynasty, ruling from Bubastis. His reign marked a new phase in Egyptian history, the age of Libyan kings. Shoshenq I sought to restore Egypt's prestige. He reorganized the administration, placed loyal family members in key priestly and military positions, and campaigned into Canaan, where he captured several towns. His triumph was commemorated at Karnak, carved on the Bubastite portal. Biblical texts refer to him as Shishak, the pharaoh who invaded Jerusalem during the reign of Rehoboam. Yet his conquests were brief. Egypt's reach was limited, and foreign powers, the Assyrians to the northeast, the Kushites to the south, were growing stronger. After Shoshenq's death, the Libyan dynasties fragmented just as the Tanites had. Different branches of his family ruled simultaneously in various cities: Leontopolis, Hermopolis, Heracleopolis, creating overlapping spheres of authority. Egypt became a patchwork of small kingdoms. The high priests of Ammonius in Thebes regained independence, and local rulers in the Delta wielded power without central control. This political disunity persisted for nearly 2 centuries. Despite the decline in royal power, Egyptian culture remained remarkably resilient. Temples continued to be built, and traditional art styles flourished. The belief in Ma'at, the cosmic order, still guided society. Even as foreign rulers rose, they adopted Egyptian customs, wrote in hieroglyphs, and built in the traditional style. The continuity of culture gave Egypt an identity that survived fragmentation. While the north weakened, a new power rose in the south. In Nubia, centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, the kingdom of Kush grew strong. Descendants of Egyptianized Nubians who had once served the new kingdom, the Kushites worshipped Ammonius and maintained many Egyptian traditions. They viewed themselves as guardians of Egypt's ancient faith, heirs to its spiritual legacy. By the 8th century BCE, their influence reached the southern border of Egypt. Pi, or Pianki, king of Kush, saw the disunity of Egypt as a divine call. Around 747 BCE, he launched a campaign northward, proclaiming that Ammonius had chosen him to restore order. His stela, discovered at Gebel Barkal, records his conquest in vivid detail. Pi's inscriptions reveal a man deeply pious and respectful of Egypt's traditions. He refused to desecrate temples or kill defeated foes, instead demanding that local rulers submit to him as the legitimate pharaoh. By around 728 BCE, Pi had unified Egypt under his rule, founding the 25th dynasty, known as the Kushite dynasty. For a brief time, the two lands were whole again. From Napata to the Delta, Egypt was ruled by kings of Nubian descent who styled themselves as restorers of ancient values. They revived old kingdom artistic forms, rebuilt temples, and reintroduced traditional hieroglyphic language. Among these rulers, Shabaka and Taharqa stand out. Shabaka consolidated Pi's gains, restoring temples and commissioning inscriptions in the ancient style. He preserved the Memphite theology, an old religious text emphasizing creation through divine word, a nod to Egypt's intellectual past. Taharqa, his successor, became one of the most powerful Kushite pharaohs. His reign saw ambitious building projects at Thebes, Memphis, and Napata, and he engaged in international politics on a grand scale. Under Taharqa, Egypt once again became a regional force. He resisted the advance of the expanding Assyrian Empire, which was then conquering the Near East. For a time, his armies held their own. But the Assyrians, under Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, launched successive invasions. In 671 BCE, they invaded Egypt, capturing Memphis and driving Taharqa into retreat. Thebes was later sacked in 664 BCE, a devastating blow that marked the end of Kushite rule in Egypt. The Assyrian conquest brought destruction but not permanent occupation. The Assyrians installed local rulers as vassals, preferring to control Egypt through intermediaries. Among these was Psamtik I, governor of Sais in the western delta. With Assyrian support, he established the 26th dynasty, later known as the Sate dynasty. His rise marked the beginning of Egypt's late period, a brief renaissance that sought to restore the nation's ancient glory. Before Psamtik's ascendancy, however, Egypt's internal landscape had already begun to change. The Libyan princes of the Delta, though fragmented, had allowed Greek and Phoenician merchants to establish settlements along the Mediterranean coast. These foreigners brought trade, new technologies, and cultural exchange. By the time Psamtik rose to power, Egypt's interaction with the wider Mediterranean world was transforming its economy and outlook. Culturally, the Third Intermediate Period had not been one of decline, but of adaptation. The spread of Libyan influence introduced new social structures, with local chieftains maintaining small armies and fortresses. Artistic expression continued to evolve. Though more provincial, it remained distinctly Egyptian in spirit. Inscriptions still praised Ammonius, Osiris, and Ra. The afterlife texts copied on coffins and papyri maintained the promise of eternal order. Even as Egypt's borders shrank, its spiritual horizon remained vast. Archaeological finds from this era, temple reliefs, bronze statuary, and faience amulets show an enduring craftsmanship and devotion to ritual. The cult of Ammonius continued in Thebes, while new deities, like Batet and Osiris Apis, gained popularity in the north. Religion became more personal, reflecting the uncertainty of the times. Ordinary people invoked household gods for protection, and funerary texts increasingly emphasized moral purity and divine justice. In Nubia, the retreating Kushite kings continued to rule from Napata and later from Meroe. They maintained Egyptian-style temples and hieroglyphic writing for centuries, creating a hybrid civilization that carried Egyptian traditions deep into Africa. Their pyramids, smaller and steeper than those at Giza, dotted the Nubian landscape, a lasting symbol of the connection between the two lands. Back in Egypt, Thebes never fully recovered from the Assyrian devastation. Its temples were plundered, its priesthood diminished. But even in ruin, Thebes remained sacred, the eternal city of Ammonius. Pilgrims continued to visit its shrines, and its name endured in prayer and poetry. The spiritual idea of Egypt, the land of the gods, the place where life and death met on the banks of the Nile, survived every conquest. The Third Intermediate Period, stretching from 1070 to 664 BCE, was an era of flux and transformation. Egypt no longer dominated its neighbors, yet its culture absorbed and reshaped every foreign influence it encountered. Libyans, Nubians, and Assyrians all became part of the Egyptian story, woven into its lineage of kings and gods. What emerged by the mid-7th century BCE was not the empire of Thutmose or Ramses, but a new Egypt, smaller, resilient, and aware of its place in a changing world. Though fractured for centuries, Egypt's continuity was never broken. The rituals performed at dawn in Thebes, the offerings laid before Ammonius, the recitations of the Book of the Dead, all continued. Beneath the political divisions, the eternal rhythm of the Nile still bound the people together. And in that rhythm, the memory of empire, of divine kingship, and of Ma'at, the order that held the universe, endured, waiting for renewal under a new dynasty. The sands of Egypt were quieter now. The grand stone temples of Karnak and Luxor still stood against the desert sun, their columns unbroken and inscriptions deep. But the Egypt that had once commanded empires no longer ruled itself. The last of the native pharaohs had seen their power ebb away, their armies crushed and their cities humbled by foreign masters. Yet even in this twilight, Egypt did not vanish. It endured, through memory, through ritual, through the belief that Ma'at, the balance of the world, must never fully fall. By 664 BCE, the land of the Nile was under the rule of the 26th dynasty, founded by Psamtik I of Sais. Egypt had been under the thumb of the Assyrian Empire for decades, but Psamtik saw an opportunity to reclaim a measure of independence. The Assyrians were weakening, stretched thin by revolts and wars in Mesopotamia. Psamtik forged alliances with Greek mercenaries, the first recorded Greeks in Egyptian service, and gradually unified the country once again. Memphis thrived under his rule. Trade with the Aegean resumed, and old temples received new life. It was a cautious revival, one that looked backward to Egypt's glorious past even as the world around it changed. This revival, known as the Sate Renaissance, sought to restore the traditions of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, both in art and governance. Scribes copied ancient texts. Temples were rebuilt in styles that echoed long-dead dynasties. Egypt, once again, became a land of order and beauty. Yet beneath this revival lay fragility. The world had shifted. Powers like Babylon and Persia were rising, and the Mediterranean was becoming a new center of influence. The Nile, however, flowed as always. Necho II, Psamtik's son, continued his father's vision. His reign from 610 to 595 BCE was ambitious. He built canals linking the Nile to the Red Sea and sought to expand Egypt's influence into Syria and Palestine. He even launched expeditions around Africa, commissioning Phoenician sailors to attempt the first known circumnavigation of the continent. But his ambitions brought Egypt into conflict with Babylon and its fierce king Nebuchadnezzar II. In 605 BCE, at the Battle of Carchemish, Egypt's army was defeated. Its dreams of empire were over once more. After Necho, Egypt remained powerful in name but vulnerable in fact. Internal divisions, economic strain, and the rise of Persia to the east all threatened its autonomy. By 525 BCE, under the rule of Psamtik III, the Persians invaded. The Great Battle came at Pelusium, on the eastern edge of the delta. Herodotus later wrote that the Persian king Cambyses II used sacred animals, including cats, to deter Egyptian archers, a story likely exaggerated but symbolic of Persia's cunning approach. Egypt fell, and for the first time in its long history, it became a province of a foreign empire. The First Persian period, 525 to 404 BCE, brought change and resistance. Persian kings ruled through satraps but respected Egyptian traditions, presenting themselves as pharaohs in temple reliefs. Yet the sense of humiliation lingered. Temples lost some of their autonomy, and native elites chafed under tribute demands. Periodic revolts broke out, led by men who claimed to restore Egyptian rule, but most were crushed swiftly. A brief window of freedom opened again in 404 BCE when a noble named Amartius led a successful rebellion. This marked the start of the 28th dynasty, followed by the 29th and 30th dynasties, all struggling to hold power amid constant Persian attempts to retake the land. Kings like Nectanebo I and Nectanebo II fortified cities, restored temples, and revived the spirit of independence. Nectanebo II in particular poured wealth into the temples of the gods, seeking divine favor to protect Egypt's sovereignty. But it was not enough. In 343 BCE, the Persians returned under Artaxerxes III, crushing the last of the native Egyptian kings. This began the Second Persian period, a final reminder that Egypt's days of rule by its own blood were nearly done. And yet, destiny had not finished with Egypt. In 332 BCE, a young Macedonian king marched into its deserts, Alexander the Great. Fresh from his victories over Persia, he arrived not as a conqueror in the eyes of the Egyptians, but as a liberator. The Persians had been hated overlords. Alexander, by contrast, honored the gods and the temples. In Memphis, he was crowned as pharaoh, and in the distant oasis of Siwa, he journeyed to consult the oracle of Ammonius, who proclaimed him the son of the god himself. To the Greeks, it confirmed his divine nature. To the Egyptians, it fulfilled an ancient pattern, the coming of a ruler chosen by the gods. Alexander's death in 323 BC shattered his vast empire, dividing it among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted companions, marking the beginning of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Although Greek in blood, the Ptolemies embraced Egyptian culture, presenting themselves as pharaohs and adopting its rituals. Greek became the language of administration, but the temples of Egypt continued their chants in hieroglyphs. The two worlds, Greek and Egyptian, coexisted in an uneasy harmony. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt's capital moved to Alexandria, a new city founded by Alexander himself. Situated on the Mediterranean coast, it became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a beacon of knowledge and culture. The Library of Alexandria, though later mythologized, symbolized a dream of universal learning. Here, scholars collected texts from across the known world, from Babylonian astronomy to Egyptian medicine, from Greek philosophy to Indian mathematics. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the seven wonders, guided ships safely to its harbor, a testament to both Greek engineering and Egyptian ambition. The early Ptolemies ruled wisely. Ptolemy II Philadelphus expanded trade, built temples, and strengthened Egypt's economy. His era saw peace and prosperity, but as generations passed, the dynasty grew entangled in its own web of intrigue. Court rivalries, assassinations, and family marriages became infamous even in antiquity. Meanwhile, Egypt's wealth attracted envy and involvement from a new power rising in the West, Rome. By the 1st century BCE, the Ptolemaic throne had become unstable. Ptolemy XII Elites, the so-called flute player, had kept his crown only through bribes to Rome. After his death, his daughter Cleopatra VII ascended the throne in 51 BCE. Intelligent, multilingual, and politically shrewd, Cleopatra sought to restore Egypt's strength through diplomacy and alliances. She met Julius Caesar in Alexandria amid civil war, famously entering his chambers rolled in a carpet, a gesture that captured both her courage and cunning. Their partnership restored her power, and from their union came a son, Caesarion, whom Cleopatra named co-ruler. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra aligned with Mark Antony, Rome's powerful general. Together they challenged Octavian, Caesar's heir. Their love affair became legend, but in political terms it was a final act of resistance, Egypt's last bid for independence. In 31 BCE, their forces were defeated at the Battle of Actium. The following year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra, faced with certain capture, took their own lives. With their deaths, Egypt became a Roman province in 30 BCE, ending over 3 millennia of pharaonic rule. Though conquered, Egypt's legacy would never truly fade. Its gods, its art, and its architecture continued to fascinate the world for centuries. The Romans, in awe of its antiquity, treated Egypt as both jewel and mystery, the land of Isis and Osiris, of pyramids older than memory. The priests continued their rituals in the great temples of Philae and Dendera long after the pharaohs were gone, preserving the echo of a civilization that had once believed it could command eternity. The twilight of ancient Egypt was not a sudden nightfall, but a slow dimming of light, a 1,000-year struggle between memory and change, between the sacred and the foreign. When the curtain finally fell in 30 BCE, it was not an ending in the true sense. The Egypt that had begun with Narmer's unification still lingered, in its language carved into stone, in the myths retold by Greek philosophers, in the symbols adopted by Rome. Even in defeat, it had achieved what its people always sought, a form of immortality. When Alexander the Great crossed into Egypt in 332 BCE, he did so at the head of an army that had conquered the Persian Empire, the power that had ruled Egypt for nearly 2 centuries. Yet the Egyptians did not meet him as an invader. To them, he was a liberator from the Persians, whose heavy taxation and foreign rule had long burdened the land. The priests of Memphis crowned Alexander as pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, son of Ammonius. He offered sacrifices to the gods of Egypt, ordered temples restored, and founded a city that would carry his name, Alexandria. Alexandria was more than a city. It was a statement of a new era. Built between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, it was planned in the Greek style: wide streets, a great harbor, a royal quarter, and a library that sought to contain all human knowledge. Greek architects designed its grid layout. Egyptian labor built its foundations. The old capital, Memphis, faded, and Alexandria became the beating heart of Egypt. Greek settlers arrived in thousands. Merchants from the Aegean filled the ports, and scholars came to seek knowledge at the famed Library of Alexandria. But the founder never saw what his city would become. In 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon, his empire stretching from Greece to India, but he left without a clear heir. His generals, the Diadochi, carved the empire into pieces. Among them was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions. Rather than fight for control of all Alexander's lands, Ptolemy secured Egypt, knowing its geography and wealth made it nearly impregnable. In 305 BCE, he declared himself Ptolemy Isoter, savior. Thus began the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Greek pharaohs who would rule Egypt for almost 3 centuries. Ptolemy ruled with a careful balance. He maintained Greek political structures for administration, but preserved Egyptian religious traditions to secure legitimacy. Like the pharaohs of old, he presented himself as divine, the intermediary between gods and men. Greek became the language of government, but temple priests continued their rituals and hieroglyphs. This dual identity defined Ptolemaic Egypt, a fusion of Greek intellect and Egyptian spirituality. Under Ptolemy I and his successors, Egypt prospered. The Nile's fertility, combined with efficient administration, filled royal treasuries. Alexandria became the most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world. Its museum, or House of the Muses, was a center of scholarship where thinkers such as Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Herophilus studied geometry, geography, and medicine. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Astronomers charted the stars. Physicians studied anatomy. The Library of Alexandria, though later mythologized, symbolized the intellectual ambition of the age, a repository where every known book was to be collected, copied, and translated. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who ruled from 285 to 246 BCE, expanded his father's vision. He built the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, standing over 100 meters tall on the island of Pharos. Its mirror reflected sunlight by day and fire by night, guiding ships safely into Alexandria's harbors. Ptolemy II also strengthened Egypt's trade links with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, importing spices, ivory, and exotic animals. His court was one of magnificence. Greek poets, Egyptian priests, and foreign envoys mingled in splendor. Yet beneath the wealth and brilliance lay tension. The Ptolemaic rulers were Greeks ruling over a native Egyptian majority. In the countryside, Egyptians worked the fields and paid taxes, while Greek officials governed and collected tribute. Temples continued to thrive, but resentment grew among those excluded from power. The blending of cultures was never complete. It was a hierarchy, Greek elites above, Egyptians below. Over the next century, the Ptolemies became embroiled in constant internal rivalries and wars. Ptolemy III Euergetes led successful campaigns into Syria, expanding Egypt's reach. But later rulers lacked his strength. The dynasty grew infamous for intrigue and fratricide. Brothers and sisters married each other to preserve royal blood, yet conspired to murder one another for the throne. The kingdom's vast wealth, once its greatest asset, drew both internal greed and external envy. In the 2nd century BCE, Egypt's fortunes began to decline. The cost of maintaining armies and the luxury of the court drained resources. Native uprisings erupted, particularly in Upper Egypt, where priests rallied villagers under the old gods. Greek mercenaries suppressed these revolts, deepening animosity between ruler and ruled. Meanwhile, in the wider world, new powers were rising, most notably Rome. The Ptolemies tried to maintain alliances through diplomacy. Ptolemy VI Philometor cooperated with Rome, recognizing its growing dominance in the Mediterranean. But every alliance came at a price. By the 1st century BCE, Egypt had become deeply entangled in Roman politics, a dependency cloaked as friendship. The later Ptolemies relied on Roman generals to secure their thrones, and in return, Egypt served Rome's economic needs, a grain supplier for its expanding empire. One of the most turbulent reigns was that of Ptolemy XII Auletes, who ruled from 80 to 51 BCE. Nicknamed the flute player, he was more interested in music than politics. To retain his throne, he paid enormous bribes to Rome's Senate, plunging Egypt into debt. When the Egyptians revolted, he fled to Rome, leaving his daughter Cleopatra VII to claim power. Cleopatra VII was no ordinary queen. Born in 69 BCE, she was well-educated, fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, which few Ptolemies bothered to learn. Unlike her predecessors, she immersed herself in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, appearing as Isis reborn to her people. Her intellect, charm, and political acumen made her a formidable ruler in an age dominated by men. When her father died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra ruled jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as tradition required. But the relationship quickly deteriorated. Court factions split, and soon Cleopatra was driven from Alexandria. She gathered troops in Syria, preparing to reclaim her throne. Fate intervened in the form of Julius Caesar, who arrived in Egypt in 48 BCE, pursuing his rival Pompey. Pompey sought refuge with Ptolemy XIII, but the boy king's advisors, hoping to gain Caesar's favor, had Pompey killed and presented his severed head to the Roman general. Caesar, disgusted, turned on them. It was at this moment that Cleopatra saw her opportunity. According to legend, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, hidden in a carpet. When it was unrolled before him, she emerged, a theatrical gesture that captured both his imagination and his heart. Cleopatra regained her throne with Caesar's support. Together, they restored order in Alexandria, and after a brief war, Ptolemy XIII was defeated and drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra ruled alongside another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, though real power was hers. She bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV Caesarion, whom she proclaimed co-ruler, the child of a god and goddess, heir to both Rome and Egypt. Cleopatra accompanied Caesar to Rome in 46 BCE, where her presence caused scandal. The Roman elite saw her as an exotic seductress, yet Caesar honored her openly. Statues of her as Isis were erected in Rome, a shocking gesture in a city proud of its traditions. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra fled back to Egypt. Her position was precarious once again, but she remained undaunted. Rome now descended into chaos, divided between Caesar's heir Octavian and his loyal general Mark Antony. Cleopatra allied herself with Antony, who saw in Egypt a source of wealth and power to rival Rome itself. Their partnership was political and personal. Together, they had 3 children, and Antony granted Cleopatra vast territories, Cyprus, parts of Syria, and lands along the Red Sea. For a moment, Egypt seemed to reclaim its imperial grandeur. But in Rome, Octavian turned public opinion against them. He portrayed Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign queen, betraying Rome for lust and luxury. In 31 BCE, Octavian's fleet met Antony and Cleopatra's forces at the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Cleopatra commanded part of the Egyptian navy herself, but when the tide turned, she retreated to Alexandria. Antony followed, and their forces disintegrated. The final chapter came swiftly. Octavian invaded Egypt in 30 BCE. Antony, facing defeat, took his own life. Cleopatra followed soon after, choosing death over humiliation. Ancient accounts say she died from the bite of an asp, though the truth remains uncertain. With her death, Egypt fell under Roman rule. Octavian, now Augustus Caesar, annexed it as a Roman province, ending over 3,000 years of pharaonic history. Under Rome, Egypt was no longer ruled by kings, but by governors. The temples continued their rituals, and Egyptian priests still chanted hymns to Isis and Osiris, but the spirit of independence had passed. The language of government became Latin, and the Nile's grain fed the Roman populace. Alexandria remained a center of learning for centuries, but its golden age faded. The Ptolemaic period had been one of contradiction, immense cultural brilliance paired with political decay. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian worlds created art, science, and literature that shaped civilizations to come. The study of anatomy by Herophilus, the geometry of Euclid, the calculations of Eratosthenes, the astronomy of Hipparchus, all flourished in the shadow of the temples. Yet the dynasty's reliance on intrigue and foreign alliances doomed it. When Cleopatra died, she was the last pharaoh, Greek by descent, Egyptian by spirit. In her, the long thread of Egypt's history, from Narmer to Ramses, from Thebes to Alexandria, finally came to rest. Her reign was both an ending and a transformation. For though Egypt lost its sovereignty, its culture would ripple outward into Rome and beyond. The gods of Egypt would be worshipped across the empire. Its art would inspire generations. Its mysteries would linger in memory. The Greek pharaohs had sought to rule Egypt, and in the end, Egypt ruled them. When the dust settled on the shores of the Mediterranean in 30 BCE, Egypt no longer belonged to its own. The death of Cleopatra VII ended 3 millennia of native monarchy. For the first time, Egypt was not ruled by a pharaoh, a divine intermediary of Ma'at, but by distant emperors in Rome. Octavian, now Augustus Caesar, claimed the title of King of Kings and declared Egypt his personal property, separate from the rest of the Roman provinces. To the Romans, Egypt was not merely another conquest. It was a prize of immeasurable wealth, the granary of the empire, and a jewel of ancient wisdom. Roman soldiers occupied the great city of Alexandria, their banners fluttering where Greek and Egyptian standards once flew. The governor of Egypt, called the Praefectus Egypti, was always a knight of Rome, never a senator, for Augustus feared that any senator might use Egypt's resources to challenge his rule. The Nile's grain, shipped annually to feed the Roman populace, became Egypt's new tribute. Control of that river meant control of the empire's bread. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, kept much of Egypt's administrative structure intact. Greek remained the language of government, and native priests continued to oversee temple lands. Taxes were meticulously collected, harvests weighed, irrigation recorded, and labor registered on papyrus rolls. The bureaucracy that had first formed under the early dynasties now served a new master. Temples such as those of Isis at Philae, Horus at Edfu, and Hathor at Dendera remained active. The images of the pharaoh were replaced with those of the emperor, but the rituals endured almost unchanged. Statues of Augustus were carved in pharaonic style, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, their forms identical to those of kings who had lived 2,000 years before. The priests of Egypt adapted to Roman power, as they had once adapted to the Greeks. They performed their rituals for the emperor as the living Horus, ensuring the continuity of Maat. Yet, beneath the surface, Egypt was changing. The temples began to lose their estates and their wealth. The old priestly schools declined as Greek philosophy and Roman law became the instruments of status and authority. The hieroglyphic script, once the sacred language of divine communication, slowly gave way to the cursive Demotic and eventually to Greek and Latin. Alexandria remained a city of intellect and trade. Its harbors bustled with ships from all over the Mediterranean, laden with grain, papyrus, glass, and linen. The city was a melting pot of cultures, Greek philosophers lecturing in the colonnades, Egyptian priests chanting in the temples, Roman officials issuing decrees from marble halls, and Jewish scholars debating in their synagogues. It was in Alexandria that the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, had been produced centuries earlier, a symbol of the city's role as a meeting place of worlds. Within its famed library, scholars continued their work, though the great collection had already suffered fires during Caesar's campaigns. Under the early Roman emperors, parts of the library were restored, and a secondary collection, the Serapeum, held thousands of scrolls. The Serapeum, dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian fusion deity created under the Ptolemies, became the spiritual and intellectual heart of the city. In its courtyards, philosophers discussed astronomy, mathematics, and metaphysics. Alexandria remained, for a time, the mind of the ancient world, but the peace of the empire never truly stilled Egypt. Heavy taxation and the burden of labor bred unrest. Peasant revolts flared in Upper Egypt, especially in Thebes, where memories of the old gods were strongest. The Roman legions crushed these uprisings with efficiency, but the tension between foreign rulers and the Egyptian countryside remained constant. By the 2nd century CE, Egypt's wealth enriched Rome, yet its people gained little from the exchange. Roman emperors visited Egypt rarely, but its mystique fascinated them. Emperor Hadrian, who toured the province in 130 CE, founded the city of Antinopolis on the Nile to honor his companion Antinous, who drowned in the river. Statues of the youth, sculpted in Egyptian style, were placed in temples across the empire. Even as Egypt served as a province, it continued to shape Roman religion and art. Roman citizens prayed to Isis for safe voyages and fertility. Her temples stood beside those of Jupiter and Mars. The old gods of the Nile found new life in lands far from their home. In the 3rd century, a crisis swept through the Roman world. Invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse weakened imperial control. Egypt, too, felt the tremors. Between 260 and 270 CE, the Palmyrene Queen Zenobia briefly seized Egypt, ruling it as part of her short-lived empire centered in Syria. The Roman Emperor Aurelian reconquered it, but the rebellion revealed how fragile Roman power could be along the Nile. Egypt's grain remained essential, yet the empire's grip was loosening. By the time of Diocletian in the late 3rd century, the Roman state reorganized itself to survive. Diocletian reformed the administration of Egypt, dividing it into smaller provinces and increasing taxation. He also struck back at growing religious unrest. The spread of Christianity, which had begun in Alexandria as early as the 1st century CE, now threatened the authority of both emperor and temple. Christians refused to worship the traditional gods or the emperor's image, and their faith spread quickly among urban populations. Diocletian's edicts led to waves of persecution, but the new religion could not be stamped out. In 313 CE, Constantine the Great legalized Christianity, transforming the empire's spiritual landscape. Temples that had stood since the days of Ramses and Thutmose began to close, their priests dismissed, their revenues seized. In Alexandria, the conflict between pagans and Christians turned violent. The Serapeum, once a beacon of learning, became a fortress in the city's riots. In 391 CE, following imperial orders, the bishop Theophilus led the destruction of the Serapeum. Statues of Serapis were torn down. The last fragments of the great library likely perished with it. The ancient faith of Egypt, which had endured foreign conquests for thousands of years, was extinguished in the fire and dust of that day. Yet even then, in the remote south of the country, the temples along the Nile's cataracts still whispered the old prayers. The Temple of Philae, dedicated to Isis, continued its rituals long after Christianity had become dominant. Pilgrims from Nubia brought offerings. Hymns were sung to the mother of Horus. The priests carved hieroglyphic inscriptions on the temple walls, the last of their kind. One of these, dated to 394 CE, records a dedication to Isis and Horus, marking the final known use of hieroglyphs in history. The script that had once proclaimed the triumphs of Narmer, Djoser, and Ramses now fell silent. The centuries that followed saw Egypt woven deeper into the fabric of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Greek remained the language of the cities. Coptic, the last stage of the Egyptian tongue written in Greek letters, was used by the Christian population. Monasticism, born in the deserts of Egypt through figures like Anthony the Great and Pachomius, spread throughout Christendom. The same deserts that had once sheltered priests of Ammonius now echoed with the prayers of monks. Egypt, once the land of gods and temples, became the cradle of Christian spirituality. Alexandria remained influential, its church one of the great centers of early Christianity alongside Rome, Constantinople, and Antioch. The catechetical school of Alexandria produced theologians such as Clement and Origen, who sought to reconcile faith with philosophy. Yet theological disputes also tore the city apart. In 415 CE, during one of these upheavals, the philosopher Hypatia, last of the Neoplatonists, was murdered by a mob, a tragic symbol of the passing of the ancient intellectual world. Despite turmoil, Egypt continued to serve as a vital province of the Byzantine realm. Its grain still sustained the empire's armies and cities, just as it had fed Rome centuries before. But its identity, once forged by pharaohs and preserved through conquerors, had transformed. The old gods faded into memory, their temples buried beneath the sands. Yet the structure of Egyptian life, The villages along the floodplain, the cycles of the Nile, the resilience of its people endured. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian ordered the closure of the last remaining pagan sanctuaries. The Temple of Isis at Philae was finally shut down, its priests dispersed. Some fled south into Nubia, carrying the last embers of Egypt's ancient faith beyond the frontier. The Nile, which had witnessed unbroken ritual for 5,000 years, flowed on in silence. By the time the Arabs conquered Egypt in 641 CE, the land had already changed many times over. The pharaonic past had become a distant legend, the meaning of hieroglyphs long forgotten. Yet even under new rulers and new faiths, the ancient monuments remained. Travelers of every age gazed upon the pyramids and temples with wonder, just as Romans and Greeks had before them. Through all these transformations, Roman, Byzantine, Christian, and Islamic, Egypt's continuity lay in the landscape itself. The Nile's rhythm never altered. Its waters still rose and fell as they had in Narmer's time. The people still built their homes on the flood's edge, harvested grain, and offered prayers for the river's return. Beneath the surface of changing empires, the old pulse endured. When hieroglyphs were rediscovered millennia later, unlocked by Jean-François Champollion after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 CE, the silence of Egypt's past was finally broken. The kings and priests who had spoken in forgotten symbols once again had voices. Modern scholars traced each name, each reign, each prayer carved in stone, reconnecting humanity with one of its oldest civilizations. What had begun with the unification of the two lands around 3100 BCE, the dawn of history, found its echo in the modern rediscovery of that history. The Roman conquest had ended Egypt's independence, but not its story. The temples, the language, the art, and the spirit of continuity that defined Egypt outlasted empire after empire, flowing onward like the river itself, eternal, unbroken, and remembering.